This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first line of question is going to be for Mr. Sabia. Now, Mr. Sabia, you sat on the advisory council from 2016 to 2017, and I understand that the council was instrumental in providing advice to the bank. Is it fair to say that you had a good understanding and knowledge of the design and construction of the bank as an advisory council member?
Chair, I think we need to pull back a little bit here and think about the role of the Growth Council overall. So the Growth Council, to the best of my recollection, was intended to be a source of additional ideas to the government to address a big challenge that faced Canada at the time, continues to be, which is to enhance Canada's potential rate of economic growth, particularly on a per capita basis. So,
About Mr. Sabia? The Deep Dive Infrastructure Agency, was that what that was about? Does that tie into your answer there?
Yes, it certainly does. Because growth is about the combination, as you know, of labor force growth and productivity. And infrastructure is an indispensable part of improving Canada's productivity. Now, it requires other things as well, but infrastructure is an important piece of it. So my point here,
Mr. Sabia,
is
for the answer, I have very limited time, so you did answer the question sufficiently. Thank you. You were also president and CEO of Chaise du Dépôt et Placement du Québec, CDPQ, from 2008 to February 2020. While you sat on the advisory council and the council that provided advice and recommendation to the bank. That's correct. You had both positions at that same time, correct?
well, my employment was being the CEO of La Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec on a volunteer basis. I accepted to participate in the work of the Growth Council.
Wonderful. So that knowledge of the creation of the bank actually paid off, because the very first investment that you made in the infrastructure, the very first investment that the Canada Infrastructure Bank made after its creation was in the amount of $1.28 billion, which was awarded to a project run by the institutional investor that you were president and CEO of at the time, correct?
Yes, but those two things are completely unconnected.
But they may be, but do they not look like a conflict of interest to you, sir?
No, they don't.
So during the time with the Quebec Pension Fund, did you engage in contracts with McKinsey?
Yes, I think we did use McKinsey from time to time at CDPQ. I think we did, yeah.
Okay, let me refresh your memory. In fact, during the time as president of the pension fund, your organization awarded contracts to McKinsey. Do you recall the value of those contracts?
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Now, were any of those McKinsey projects in relation to the CDPQ Montreal REM light rail project?
I do not recall precisely, but I think not, although I could be corrected on that.
Let me jog your memory. An access to information request, in fact, shows that McKinsey was awarded $6.5 million in contracts between 2019 and 2021. Does that refresh your memory, sir?
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were involved in anything to do with the REM. That would have been a broader set of contracts that we would have issued, which could be for a whole variety of things. As you know, CDPQ manages a portfolio today of over $400 billion of assets invested around the world. So the activities of CDPQ are very extensive and touch a full range of asset classes. So that number doesn't necessarily imply any particular involvement in the REM, and I can't. As I sit here this morning, I can't recall whether or not they were specifically involved in that, but I believe not.
Okay, that's a fair answer. Now, sir, when you were appointed chair of the board of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, did you have any concerns about the perceived conflict of interest around engagement with McKinsey by the bank and McKinsey actually benefiting from the deep understanding of the CIB, by extension benefiting McKinsey clients? Did you have any concerns about that? One of which would have been the organization that you were CEO of, the CDPQ.
Well, no, but wait a second. You've not got the chronology right. When I accepted to chair the board of the Infrastructure Bank, by then I was no longer the CEO of CDPQ.
Now, Mr. Sabia, I imagine you worked fairly closely with Mr. Dominic Barton during the course of the advisory council work that you did?
Yes, along with the other members, yes.
And you were chair of the Canada Infrastructure Bank from April 20th to December 20th, correct?
April of 2020 to December of 2020. That's correct.
Sorry, yes, December 2020. Thank you. Thank you for that correction. Now, the first thing that you did was to declare that the current management of the CIB was insufficient to create the strategic framework for the bank, and so you needed a high-level, outside-in approach to assist you to create that framework, correct?
I'm sorry, I have no recollection of what you just said.
Okay, I'm going to try to refresh your memory. I'm going to refer to a memo of April 19, 2020 that's called Refreshing the CIB's Strategic Direction. And the memo is essentially to you, and it is basically, in the memo it says that you were unable to draw from the current management, so you recommend a high-level outside approach to develop the strategic themes, vectors of the bank. I can give you a direct quote from the memo if you like. Well, that is a direct quote. And that high-level outside approach was actually hiring McKinsey. So you did hire McKinsey at the outset to help you with this outside-in approach. Is that correct?
Yeah, so let's stand back. The Minister of Finance at the time, Minister Morneau, asked me to take over the chair of the Infrastructure Bank because its first 3 years had been, I would say quite slow. And he asked whether, in working with the management of the bank and outside advisors, we could accelerate the activity of the bank and what was called at the time the growth plan for the bank. So that involved trying to bring some more focus and simplification to what the bank was doing and to try to accelerate its processes so that it could step up and turn the corner, as it has now, into a much higher velocity organization. And yes, you are correct that in order to do that in the quickest and most economical way, decision taken at the time was to use some of the people from McKinsey who had been involved in the initial thinking around the infrastructure bank to draw on their accumulated knowledge of this so that we wouldn't have to start from ground zero and we would be able to move ahead quickly, which we were able to do, and you can see the results now which is a very, very substantial turnaround in the pace of activity of the bank.
For that answer. So you drew on McKinsey, and I also understand that you sought strategic advice about the infrastructure bank from Dominic Barton himself while he was ambassador to China.
That would have been, I think, quite informal conversations between me and Mr. Barton, just simply drawing on the work that we had done on the Growth Council in the past.
You may not fully have recollection of things that happened years ago, but I'm going to just refresh your memory that on June 23rd, 2020, there was a meeting that was scheduled from 8 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. with you and Dominic Barton, and it was not an informal meeting. I'm going to actually read from the memo scheduling it. Memo from Zach Coulter at McKinsey to Annie Roper at the bank dated June 17th, 2020, setting up the meeting. In that memo, it says, Dominic Barton, Dom, they called him, calendar has been pretty tight, so it looks like this is the only time we could give him. Given he's by himself, we're hoping to limit attendance to a few people. Could we hold attendance at just you and John for this one? It's a bit delicate, and I don't want to offend, but want to make sure that Dom is able to speak freely. Let me know if any issues. So you and Dom were pretty close, weren't you?
Oh, I've worked with Dominic Barton over the years, both when he was at McKinsey and then when he was Canada's ambassador to China. So it's someone I've known over the years.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours once again. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Sabia again. Now, Mr. Sabia, if we can go back to that meeting of June 23rd, 2020, that happened at 8 a.m. to 9:15. And just to confirm that meeting was set up while Dominic Barton was still ambassador of China, and he, in fact, attended the strategic workshop that you initiated when you became chair of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Isn't that correct, Mr. Sabia?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Okay. And Zach says in the memo that things are delicate, quote unquote. What was so delicate? Was it the fact that Mr. Barton was a sitting ambassador meeting with the chair of the Infrastructure Bank, a Canadian Crown Corporation, and that he needed to speak freely about the strategic direction of the bank, as the memo said? Was that what was delicate?
Chair, I think any reasonable reading of that note that you just read out, that it's quite clear that whoever it is who's writing the memo is being careful about not offending people inside the bank by wanting to keep the numbers down to simplify the scheduling of a meeting with the then ambassador to China, who was essentially doing us, the favor of providing some of his thoughts as we worked on how can we accelerate the performance of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So I think the references there to delicate have to do with that person wanting to be careful and not offend any of the employees of the bank itself. And I don't think that there's a conspiracy hiding in behind there.
Did you not seem, it may not be a conspiracy, but did it not seem like a conflict to you?
I see it in no way as a conflict. In absolutely no way.
So the chair of the CIB meeting with the ambassador who helped create the bank.
How could that possibly be a conflict of interest when Dominic Barton was simply providing some further thinking to help accelerate our own thinking with respect to there's not even the potential for a conflict of interest there. I simply do not understand the question.
So did the bank not have sufficient human resources capacity in order to create their own strategic direction? They had to go back to Dominic Barton for this?
Look, you talk to, in the making of policy or in the making of decisions in large corporations or small corporations, you always reach outside. You always want to talk to other people. You always want to gather the greatest number of ideas and perspectives that you can, because the world's a complex place, and you always want new ideas, different thinking, different perspectives, because that's how you make good decisions. So it's not as though the institution didn't have capable people in it. The institution has very capable people in it, particularly with respect to its leadership.
Mr. Sabio, is that why
It's always a good idea to reach outside and get different views. That's just good management.
Excellent. Thank you for that question, that answer. Now, is that why you reached out to McKinsey and you engaged McKinsey while you were at the bank, while you were chair, and you actually engaged in a fairly high-profile McKinsey summit called the Global Infrastructure Initiative? Was that one of the reasons why you did that?
Look, those kinds of conferences are opportunities to exchange views, again, hear different perspectives, gain the benefit of activities going on in other projects, other countries. That's a way of both contributing to the global conversation around issues of considerable importance across many countries. It's a way of contributing to that, and it's a way of learning from that.
And you were...
Again, it's a pretty straightforward activity. And again, it's about getting out, getting ideas, contributing ideas. And for Canada, it's about Canada and being part of these global conversations on big issues, which is always to the benefit of the country.
And those global conversations on big issues, you had quite a few of them in your friendly relationship with McKinsey during that short period of time that you were at the bank. Isn't that correct? That wasn't the first time you spoke on a McKinsey panel.
No, but I've spoken on all sorts of panels, whether it's Canadian Chambers of Commerce panels, Boards of Trade panels,
Thank you.
BCG panels, all kinds of panels.
Thank you very much.
That's part of what being a senior executive is.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Point of order. Point of order. I am
we have a point of
really
order.
tired of Miss O'Connell's personal attacks. Miss O'Connell just mentioned that I met with a German MP, which I did as a part of my job description. Now, she actually has stated that I am a Nazi sympathizer before, and I take deep exception to these personal attacks that she is spewing at both in committee and in the House. And if she's going to do that, I'm going to ask that you say it privately so I could sue you outside of the committee.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. I'll ask all members to keep side chatter at a minimum, please.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Ms. Therian a question about the way in which you perceive that the bank has moved away from its mandate, its original mandate, and has moved into a relationship that has changed its mandate from what it's created with the advisory council, starting from the advisory council through to its intermingling with McKinsey.
Sure. So, I mean, again, when the federal government and the current federal government back in the election period in 2015 had floated the idea of the public infrastructure bank, the vision at that point and the stated intention was to provide that the mandate of the bank would be to provide low-cost loans for local governments to finance new public infrastructure and strengthen their communities. So that was what was originally proposed back in the platform of the government in 2015. And so again, with the involvement of McKinsey and BlackRock, there was this shift to focus on trying to attract private capital. And there was sort of this, pie in the sky promise that there would be a 5-to-1 ratio of public dollar or private dollars coming in to assist with that. And we've seen over the 5 years that has not been the case, that in fact the bank has been struggling to maintain even a 1-to-1 ratio of public to private dollars. And so the result of that is that municipalities, as we heard, some of them are being declined for the projects that they're applying for, which again is very necessary infrastructure. Those of us that have I mean, we all, live in places where we know the roads are aging, and all the piping and underground infrastructure that we can't see is, needs repair. And so if projects are either not being accepted because they don't have that requisite private partner, that's a problem. And again, even having a private partner, we've seen in different municipalities the issues that can go along with that. And so Mapleton's a big example of that. And there's several others throughout the country. And I think, again, the main purpose of a public bank, and the ones that have been successful that we see primarily over in Europe, but in certainly other countries and continents, is that they do have a very public focus, and that their guarantees are backed by the municipalities or the countries that are signatories to those public banks, and that ensures that the funding is flowing directly to the municipalities, to the communities, to those public projects that really needs to be financed, without having to go through the hoops of having private investment involved. And then again, CUPE is always concerned, as we should be, about the threat of increased privatization of public services. In transit, it's an interesting one. It's great that there's funding coming in to help make transit more sustainable, in terms of environmentally sustainable. Transit systems in North America in particular they don't make money. They're never going to make money. They're an essential service that municipalities are bound to provide. And so, again, to bring private capital that has the interest in making money into something like transit, well, they're not going to make money on that. So the end result is going to be higher user fees. And what we've seen in other cities, cutting hours, cutting the services, that people rely on.
Thank you for that answer. I just want to pose a question to both Mr. Brown and Ms. Raitt. Now, the purpose of this study is to look at how the bank started and its knowledge of the bank and McKinsey contracts. Now, you both gave evidence today, and it appears that neither of you have any knowledge of the beginning of the bank and its relation to McKinsey contract. Is that correct, starting first with Ms. Raitt?
You are correct, Dr. Liu.
Thank you. And Mr. Brown, would you also say that the subject of this study, that the evidence you gave does not really tie into the subject of this study pertaining to your knowledge of McKinsey contracts at the beginning of the bank? You do not have that expertise, right, Mr. Brown?
No, I cannot speak to McKinsey contracts and the start of the bank. I can only speak to how this infrastructure bank has helped the city of Brampton.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. So back to, how many minutes do I have?
You have about 40 seconds.
40 seconds. Okay, so Mr. Savia, can you tell me what other engagements you've had with McKinsey over the years, especially while you were with the Infrastructure Bank?
I believe, as I was only chair of the board of the Infrastructure Bank for a number of months, and I believe the only work that was done that I was aware of at the time was the work that we've already discussed to help accelerate the bank going forward. That was, to my recollection, that is all there is.
The Infrastructure Bank is a taxpayer-funded bank, as you know, and so the coziness of the bank with McKinsey creates the impression that there is an actual or even perceived conflict. So I'm going to highlight some of the interactions and ask the question why you believe that the public perception of conflict is not so. McKinsey provided pro bono research support to the Advisory Council, which was chaired by McKinsey Global Managing Partner Dominic Barton. Then you sat on the council as a member appointed by the minister and as an institutional investor. Then you, Mr. Sabia, headed up the discussions around creating and designing an infrastructure bank. The council then recommended the creation of the Infrastructure Bank. The bank announced its first investment in the summer of 2018 in Montreal, the Montreal Light Rail project, which your pension fund was running. To those looking from outside, it looks like a conflict of interest for you, having benefited from sitting on the council that recommends the bank, which then awards your organization a taxpayer-funded investment. Can you explain why that perception is not so, or if it is so, why it happened?
Well, it's not so. And first off, to just correct something, Chair, that the Member of Parliament has said, I was not involved at all in setting up the bank. That was done by the government following the receipt of the recommendations of the Growth Council and I presume internal deliberations within the government, and that they then set about the work of setting up the bank itself. So just to be clear, I was not involved in that at all. Point number one. Point number two, the decision on the part of the government to participate in the financing of the light rail project in Montreal was again a decision in which I had and CDPQ had absolutely no role. That was a decision taken by the government in collaboration with the Infrastructure Bank, I am sure, although I wasn't involved, to ensure that that the structure of that financing was consistent with the mandate of the bank and that the bank was comfortable, et cetera, et cetera. Again, those are decisions in which I had absolutely no part. So given that, I fail to see how there is either certainly not the reality of a conflict, and I cannot even see how there could be the appearance of a conflict if one actually knows the facts about what happened.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sabia. Again, you joined the bank in 2020 as chair, and within a month, you signed another contract with McKinsey, and that was a sole source contract that McKinsey gets. There was previous they got because of their previously deep knowledge about the bank. Now, in addition to that, Dominic Barton participates in that work through a workshop. They help develop a new strategy for the bank and work on a growth plan that would fund infrastructure projects with a focus on net zero targets. And then that summer, you participate in a McKinsey-hosted panel called Resetting After COVID in June 2020. And that October, you announce a $10 billion growth plan with the Prime Minister that is partially the result of McKinsey contributions to that plan. Now, it seems to me that you have quite a history of engagement with McKinsey because you even joined the bank, and then while you were at the bank, you continued to interact with McKinsey. Now, all of this in context of that the bank was created with the help of McKinsey, although not created, as you clarified how it was done, but McKinsey was informing the creation of the bank and from its inception, and given what seems like preferential access thereafter to the bank. All the while, the bank looks like it's a dud, and it's been in operation for 6 years with no projects yet completed. Now, this looks like there is some sort of perceived conflict. Now, can you explain why there is or is not for the public, please?
20-second response, please, Mr. Sabia.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I can't respond to that in 20 seconds because that's just not the case. Number one, the Member of Parliament just mentioned 6 years where the bank hadn't accomplished anything. That's simply just not true. That the bank, after 3 years of operation, really did step up the velocity of its activity, as another member of the panel, Madame Raitt, mentioned earlier. So the bank is up and running and delivering and doing what it needs to do. I already addressed the question about participating in conferences, which, at the time I did as a matter of course for all kinds of different organizations. I've already addressed that. There's just absolutely, I just cannot see why the Member of Parliament continues to come back on this issue about conflict of interest when there aren't any, either perceived or real.
Thank
These
you.
are independent decisions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sabia.